welcome. My name is Kalpana McCann, and I'm your moderator for today's session with Wade Repta, entitled Wellness Trends Affecting Teachers in 2024. This is the second of three wellness workshops Wade will be presenting for OTF in the coming weeks. Before we begin, I'd like to read OTF's land acknowledgement. OTF's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge first and foremost that we are gathered in the province of Ontario on the traditional territories of various Indigenous peoples who have been present on this land known as Turtle Island since time memorial. We acknowledge that this has been a meeting ground for generations. We are grateful to the stewards and caretakers of this land. As advocates, teachers, and educators, we understand our collective responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land. We further recognize and honor within the membership of OTF those who are Indigenous to this land. This practice of recognizing the ancestral and traditional lands in which we work, live, and play is a concrete action that we undertake as a first step towards reconciliation between Canadians and the Indigenous peoples of this land. But it is not our only step. Collectively and individually, we must seek to denounce the injustices and the wrongs that have been committed against the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and to dedicate ourselves to cultivating and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and truth. Wade is the Vice President of Human Works, co-founder of Human Work Press, and the author of The Well Teacher. Wade is an occupational therapist who has worked with teachers and educators for over 20 years to help them minimize barriers and remain working in the classroom. He has provided many years of clinical support to Human Works consultants and continues to work with teachers throughout British Columbia as part of the BCTF Health and Wellness Program and the Well Teacher Groups. Please welcome Wade.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Wade. Don't have too much to say beyond the intro. I'll do a quick little intro, but not too much more to say. For those of you who were last week, welcome back. For those of you who were not, it's nice to have you here. I work for a company called Human Works, and I live on Vancouver Island. As we heard, I'm an occupational therapist. And so I get to live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people. That's me, which is broad, but we're pretty spread out around here. So at the end of the day, what we're going to try to cover today, I'll just say I grew up in Hamilton, so I'm an Ontario person transplanted out to BC. I work with the BCTF. We have with the teachers union out here in BC. We have what's called the Health and Wellness Program. So my day-to-day work, my daily interactions with people are directly with teachers who are struggling with lots of different sort of types of wellness challenges right across the spectrum, some of which we're going to talk about today. I've been doing it for 24 years now, so quite a while. And, sort of putting all that together a few years ago, we decided to write The Well Teacher, which is sort of how I started to become a little bit more not famously known, but known in Ontario with some connections. And so that's kind of why I'm being asked to speak today, is just some of the work we do on our day-to-day and also from the Well Teacher. And if, I think the goal for today, we are a pretty small group, first of all, and I want this to be helpful for the people who are attending. So if you have questions, you can just literally just shout them out. I can't see you, but so you can just literally just shout them out, or you can put them in the chat. If you have comments, if there's anything you want me to explain, or you even just want to comment on your own experiences, by all means, you can just do that. So we're going to try to keep it as informal as we can. I have lots of stuff. Like I always have more than I need in case we sort of trend in a certain direction for information. So you'll see me skip a few things, and there are handouts of the slides available, both in color and in black and white for anybody who finds the color to be a little bit too much. So you have that available. We know that when it comes to the types of challenges that teachers face, there's the kind of common ones that we get asked to talk about them all the time: anxiety, depression, burnout, balance, fatigue, pain. Even in some of our talk that we had last week was about sort of a lot about pain and fatigue. These are more of the common things, and they are still, and they're real, and they're important to talk about. But what we've seen over the last few years are some emerging trends. And that's what we're going to chat a little bit about today. And those emerging trends are about neurodiversity, concussion, and trauma. Now, how do you talk about these things in an hour? You don't. You kind of just touch the surface a little bit. Our purpose for today is not to get into the what's, like what is concussion and getting into the physiology and all the newest research and science. We're not going to do that today. We're going to talk about the hows in terms of how does that relate to teaching? How are some strategies, like what are some of the strategies people can use? How do people cope with these challenges? So we're going to touch the surface on some of this. If you have any questions or you need anything to be explained, just fire away. The starting point, and if you only remember one thing from this conversation, it's the idea that all three of these different types of, we'll put them under the umbrella of disability for the sake of the conversation, okay? All of this, when we think of them as disability, it all comes down to noise. And they're all very similar in terms of how they can affect people in a school environment. So whereas they may have a different basis in terms of sort of physiologically and medically, these challenges, how they affect people, the symptoms are very similar. And the challenges that we see from teachers who are experiencing these challenges are very similar. And when we try to explain it to teachers who are struggling with any of these challenges, we try to relate things in terms of noise. Okay, so I talked about this a little bit when we had some questions about concussions last week. But when we think about noise in a classroom, we're not just talking about the noise of a classroom. We're talking about all of the stimulation, all of the stuff that's coming at people at all times. And when you've been in a classroom or even just a school, you might not be in a classroom environment, but just being in a school and you've been there for a while and you're doing well, your brain starts to be able to filter and you don't realize all the noise that's coming at you. The noise being acoustic noise, the light, all the movement, all the colors, all the things that your brain just perceives as noise. And with all of these challenges, your brain has a hard time filtering some of this noise. So when we're trying to figure out how to assist teachers with managing these challenges, it's how do we minimize the noise in that teacher's situation. So if they're in the classroom, if they're in a non-enrolling position, if they're in an itinerant position, we're trying to minimize noise. So that is really my most important point is right off the bat. And what we'll be talking about from there is specific ways to minimize that. Teaching is hard for all teachers. It's a hard job, right? Like right off the bat, the best teacher on their best day is working at the top of this curve. And what this curve is, it's a performance stress curve. So we know that when people are in jobs that they're not challenged or in situations they're not challenged, they actually perform pretty poorly. So we can see performance on the left and stress on the bottom. And stress can be stress, actual, like how we think of stress. Stress can be just challenge and difficulties. Stress can also be that noise that I'm talking about, right? So we know that we need some challenge in our lives to be able to function. Teachers are already functioning at the top of this curve. So if somebody is in a situation where they're having challenges related to concussions or trauma or ADHD, neurodiversity, then there's more noise associated with that. So we often see teachers who really struggle with their ability to function in the classroom because there's just too much noise, and that translates to too much stress. So what we're trying to do is trying to figure out a way to help people perform by minimizing the noise and minimizing the stress to keep people here. But the starting point is the top of the curve. That's where people are starting. So once they start to slide down the other side, it's a little bit harder to bring it back. But when you think about like, why does this extra noise affect people? It's because you're already at the top of the curve. And that you might be here for yourself. You might be here to support other people or just for the information. So it might not be you, but even thinking about your colleagues who may have challenges related to these things, like that's kind of where people are starting from. They're starting from a point of, as soon as you start to have some difficulties, you start sliding down. So we're going to go through some of these topics. I'm going to move through them. And if you have any questions, by all means, just shout them out. Before I do that, I'll just look and see what's in the chat.
We
Just
are
so I
good.
don't miss anything.
I've just put in both links for your
Oh, perfect. Good.
Human
Yeah.
Works for
Yeah.
everyone to have,
Great.
but that's it so
Great.
far.
Great. Okay. Um, the term neurodiversity is actually a relatively new term, and neurodivergent. Those are the two terms that you'll hear sort of associated with neurodiversity. Relatively new. It's through the 90s, towards the late 90s, where they actually started becoming just a term at all. And really, I think from a clinical perspective, the term has really come to the forefront post-COVID. So it was starting to gain traction pre-COVID, But post-COVID, we're really starting to see a lot more people identified as being neurodiverse, and that we're hearing the term a lot more. So what does it mean? It actually, it's hard to describe because it doesn't really mean anything per se. There's not like a medical definition of what neurodiversity means. It really describes more of an experience, right? That people experience and interact with the world around them in different ways. So there's no one right way of thinking. There's no right way of learning or behaving. And the differences between people, when we think about neurodiversity, are not viewed as deficits. Okay, so just right off the bat, being able to do something or not do something doesn't mean like you're better or worse. These things are not seen as deficits. It's not a medical term. It's not a diagnosis. Nobody's diagnosed with neurodiversity. There are dozens and dozens, and we're not going to go through them today, of different sort of labels or diagnoses or disorders. Tend to slant towards the disorder categories for neurodiversity, and it's a better way to explain where people are at. But even still, talking about sort of being more neurotypical, which we'll get to in a sec, the idea that people are just different. And because somebody is different doesn't mean they need to have a label. And if we are going to have a label around that, the idea is to try to help people figure out around what their strengths and what their challenges are. So for instance, if we say somebody has ADHD, why are we labeling them with ADHD? The idea is to try to help them work through some of the challenges they may have, but still being able to keep some of their strengths. So really, when we talk about being neurodivergent, we're trying to more think about it as being differently abled. I think what we're going to see not too long from now is this dichotomy between being neurodivergent and neurotypical will actually start to disappear on the neurotypical side, because there's not really one way of thinking. There's not a sort of normal way of thinking. So neurodiversity, and the reason why the term was used was to try to take away some of the stigma and de-disability it and make it more just a part of the how humans interact with each other and how their brain functions. Okay. Saying that, when it comes to identifying some of the specific disorders, because there still is sort of a medical part to some of this, when it comes to teachers, again, there's dozens of different challenges that people can face that would be under the umbrella of neurodiversity. This is kind of what we see the most of. We're definitely seeing an increase of teachers who are being diagnosed on autism spectrum with autism spectrum disorder. Oftentimes, these are people who may have been flagged somewhat when they were younger, maybe didn't have totally appropriate testing. Maybe they weren't even sort of quote unquote labeled, but are starting to realize now that they're experiencing challenges that look very similar to either what some of their students are managing, or just being more aware of what autism is, and that as an adult, you can actually be diagnosed with autism. And again, we're seeing this way more than we were seeing even 5 years ago. ADHD is probably the most, well, it's not probably, it is definitely the most prevalent of the neurodiversity disorders that we're seeing, in terms of people coming to us and saying, I think I have adult ADHD. And so if we were to receive 10 referrals right now in a week from our program, I would say at least a third of them would involve people wanting to explore more around ADHD and some of the challenges that they're having. They may have other concerns as well, but it's super, super common. It's definitely the most emerging of all the trends we're seeing right now. We're also seeing trends around trauma and trauma responses. This was starting before COVID and definitely came to a head during COVID, and now post-COVID. They're definitely having a lot more people who are identifying as having challenges related to trauma. And then there's some various other things that we'll see with teachers as well. Sensory integration disorder has come up a few times. Giftedness has come up, just various learning disabilities. And the last thing is just the what are typically more thought of as mental health conditions, which still can be, but people who are not really mentally ill per se, but struggling with anxiety, some sort of, I'll say lower level, not severe bipolar disorder, but more of a less sort of bigger swing on things, and obsessive compulsive disorder. So people who are not dysfunctional because of obsessive thinking, but just find that they obsess with things a little bit more. So instead of labeling these conditions as mental health and mental illness, they're being thought of more as, it's kind of normal. Like lots of people have anxiety, low to moderate levels of anxiety, even on a day-to-day basis. Does that mean they're mentally ill? Or does that mean that that's just maybe a normal part of the human condition and it's more neurodiverse? We don't think of mental illness as a negative anyway. So from our perspective, it doesn't maybe really matter, but it might matter for how that person manages, who the people are that they consult with, the type of counseling they might be getting. Like these things might change depending on how it's viewed and whether it's more a neurodivergent situation or a mental health situation. It could change it somewhat. So these are the things that we see the most of. All right. Yeah, and feel free to share if you want. Obviously, there's no, you don't have to share anything about yourself, but if you want, you absolutely can do that. When it comes to autism, we're not going to get too much into, again, like the physiology of autism, but what we see with teachers is kind of like the traditional things you would think about with students, but sometimes with a slightly different slant. When it comes to autism, with the teachers that we've worked with, that we're seeing is like, it's not just the idea that people feel that people with autism don't have emotions. This is absolutely not true. Just because not everybody who has autism shows emotion, there's actually a lot of information to show that people with autism actually feel more emotion about things than some people who don't have autism. So it's just not everybody has the ability to show that emotion and to emote. So the emotions are there, but the ability to emote them are not always there, or not always in line with what we would think would be quote unquote normal, right? But people, and this happens a lot with teachers, there's the inability to distinguish their own emotions from what other people might be feeling as well. So the idea that if I feel this way, everybody else is feeling this way, or if they feel that other people feel a certain way, that they should also feel that way. And if they don't, that they're doing something wrong. So it's hard. Sometimes we see people struggle with colleagues, struggle with parents, and sometimes with students, although students is usually where people excel. But differentiating with other adults around like, how do I feel, and being able to separate those two. Obviously, there's also ways of like we know this with autism, that there can be different ways of communicating, which sometimes they're viewed by other people as being weird or odd or quirky. And you'll hear even people say, which is moderately offensive, I guess, like they might be on the spectrum about things for even people who aren't spectrumy. And these things, like this is offensive, right? But it's people trying to figure out where people are at. But obviously challenges with communication. And it's the communication piece that where we see teachers who start to be judged and kind of maybe unnecessarily, but get in trouble. It's around communication and sometimes being like very literal, struggling with nonverbal communication and not picking up on maybe the cues of students or the cues of other adults, whether it's parents or colleagues. People don't know why this is, but there's a term called inspecting. So they say like an autistic brain. So an autistic brain seems to be designed in some ways to look for errors. So where, again, it comes to filtering and noise in some cases, but where when people who are neurotypical, their brain is not designed to be constantly looking for errors. They kind of filter things out and they don't focus on things. Where they're finding that people who have autism are often stuck in inspecting for errors. It's the way their brain kind of works. The difficulty with that is it can work against people because it also means they're looking for errors in their self. And this is what we see with teachers with autism, is not only are they being judged by other people, but they're also being judged by themselves, because they're seeing and maybe not even correctly analyzing what's happening around, but they're seeing that sort of looking for errors in how they do things. And we know that obviously by the time that people have gotten to us, they are adults, right? Like whether it's you or your colleagues are adults. So have lots of skills, have lots of ability to manage these challenges. We do know that though a lot of energy goes into, for people who are functioning well, who it's really not neurodiversity across the spectrum of neurodiversity, but with autism, spend a lot of energy trying not to look like they have autism. And this is especially true in women. They found studies have shown that women are spend a lot more time trying to mask their challenges than men do. But on either side, a lot of energy goes into trying to appear not neurodiverse, which can therefore increase anxiety and even in some cases some stimming behaviors. So stimming behaviors are just like repetitive motions, clicking, snapping fingers. So again, these things are often perceived as being a little odd, where they're really just part of people's coping and obviously social isolation. So these are the challenges and the things that we see, and we're seeing them more and more, especially as more and more people are identifying as having autism. I worked with a person and trying to figure out like how do we support this person, and I think this was pretty poignant quote that it kind of helps me with helping people move forward a little bit. It's that saying like I'm always being told what I'm doing is wrong and sort of what not to do, but nobody ever tells me what I could do or what to keep doing. And this is what sort of the trap that people fall into in terms of like school districts and admin and people, even colleagues, like other teachers, is always telling people what they're doing wrong. But for people who are neurodiverse and have autism, the idea of like, okay, you're telling me what I'm doing wrong, but I don't necessarily know what to do right. Like it's not intuitive at all times. So instead of focusing on, how to support people, the focus is on the negative, but also forgetting like you're also doing like you're doing one thing that maybe could be tweaked, but you're doing 20 things that are awesome. But how do I know that if you just told me this thing's not good, maybe not everything's good, right? So it's trying to be aware of that, how we support people.
Wait, I just wanted to
Mm,
interrupt you. Nicole put into
mm.
the chat that she often isolates herself because people aren't very kind.
Yeah, they're not. And a lot of we're actually kind of going to talk about that. Like with all of these challenges, um, you know, how do you help people move forward? And what is your take on these? The starting point is just if everybody could just be kind to start instead of being judgmental and having expectations on like this is right and everything else is wrong. So yeah, people do end up isolating. With any challenge that teachers face, they isolate. So when it's mental health challenges, challenges around neurodiversity, trauma, even physical like pain, it is a teaching coping mechanism to isolate, because what happens is when teachers start to have any kind of struggle, they personalize it and say, I'm not doing good enough, I need to do better. And so to do that, I have to do these two things. I need to work harder and I need to do more, right? So I have to spend more time and I have to actually do more teaching, which are the two things we actually don't want people to do, because they end up just locking themselves away and doing more instead of trying to figure out ways to work more, maybe more efficiently or in a more healthy way. So when you add on the lack of kindness or the lack of support or the lack of just understanding, like not everybody's mean, they just don't get it. So when you add that in, when it comes to things like autism, there's even more likelihood of people to isolate, because you can kind of hide anxiety, you can hide fatigue, but you can't hide some of what people might see related to autism, or even related to ADHD, depending on how people present. So that's pretty common, right? Love to be able to figure out a way for the system to be more supportive, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit. So that's kind of like, again, we're just going to talk a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing. ADHD is the next one. It's important to remember, like ADHD, people who don't really know, they think it's like a learning disorder because they see it in kids and people just assume that anything that kids struggle with is a learning disorder. But it's not, it's actually a developmental disorder. I don't know if it totally matters for our purposes, but I think it's important. Like it's not an inability to learn. It's not intellectual, it's not cognitive. It's a developmental disorder that is actually starting to be a little bit, again, reframed in terms of maybe it's not. Like maybe it's just kind of normal, right? Because there's so many people who have different versions of attention deficit disorder. Now, obviously the H in ADHD is hyperactivity. We don't, most adults, especially most teachers that we see, don't really struggle with the hyperactivity part of the ADHD. They've usually got that more controlled than you would see in, say, a 10-year-old. The term used to be ADD, and then it went to ADHD, and then ADD and ADHD. ADD is kind of gone, but we're actually seeing it make a little bit of a comeback for adults because a lot of adults aren't hyper. Now, saying that, sometimes their brains are a little bit hyper, right? So Like you'll hear people say like, my brain is racing all the time, but they're not appearing to be like sort of hyperactive, right? But there's challenges around impulsiveness and focus. And you know, this stuff you all know. But there's secondary parts to ADHD that people don't really realize, that the amount of anxiety that comes with it, right? The difficulty coping, the frustration that can come both in just because everything's kind of harder and it's disorganized and harder to understand at times. So frustration and mood swings. And so sometimes mental health challenges, people will be diagnosed with anxiety or with depression when it's really ADHD. Just like the constant feelings of being scattered and disorganized and difficulty with time management and planning. Like these are the things you would see with teachers who are being challenged with ADHD. Now, again, this can look very similar to concussions. It can look very similar to autism. It can look very similar to trauma. It can look very similar to anxiety and lots of other things. But when we're trying to figure out where people are at, we're putting pieces together in terms of how they're managing their background. And again, more than anything else right now, we're seeing teachers identify as having ADHD. How would you know? A good starting point is a very disorganized teaching space. Now, this is not everybody, okay? Nobody falls into a little box, but one of it is just having a more disorganized teaching space, because it's hard for people, one, to finish tasks. So they'll start to do something and then their sort of attention goes elsewhere. And also it's hard to put things into boxes with their brains. So it's harder to put things into the right place and have an organized teaching space. It takes a lot of energy to organize. People are behind in marking and planning, and especially emails. Emails, when we do mental health talks and we'll say to people, what's the most stressful part of teaching? Um, all the time, people are like emails. So if that's just stressful for everybody, when you have difficulties with organization and focus, it's even worse. People spending lots and lots of time sort of after school hours. Many teachers work after school hours, right? Like long after school hours, but with ADHD, we see more and more of it. There's the social isolation. Um, people are seeking roles outside of classroom roles. So looking for more small group, one-on-one roles, curriculum development, things that don't involve classrooms. Classrooms are probably, not for everybody, but for most people, the most challenging environment, maybe the most challenging environment to have ADHD in the world. Like, I'm not sure how many more spaces could be more challenging than a kindergarten classroom. Like, pretty tough, especially when you add in all the expectations that go along with it, with what the space is supposed to look like and sound like, music and all the different things, right? So it can be really challenging. We see people with ADHD struggle from burnout, but early in the year. There's a pattern for many teachers where, they're burned out by the end of the school year, but teachers with ADHD are oftentimes feeling burned out in September. And of course, it's maybe the most challenging time of the year in terms of organizing and stimulation and having to remember names and getting people organized and changing kids, and you might even have your assignment changed, right? So seeing this constant overwhelm and leading to burnout like really early in the school year, September, October. If somebody tells me they're burned out in September and they didn't have major crises in the summer, then the first thing I'm thinking is this an ADHD situation, right? Can be lots of things, but it's definitely on the radar. And oftentimes we'll see for teachers, full-time is just too much. Like 4 days can be manageable. That one extra day can just not manage. So we'll see a huge change in how people function between 4 days with like a Wednesday or Thursday break, and how people function with 5 days because it's all in a row. So even having like one down day can be the difference between being a super successful, more focused teacher and being completely disorganized and just feeling overwhelmed all the time. Just that one day can make a huge difference. Sometimes even half a day for some people. The other thing we'll see with teachers is people are trying so hard to stay organized that they're actually disorganized. They have lists and lists and calendars and lists and apps and this app and this app and this sticky note and 10 sticky notes over here. And this may be you. And this is kind of what people have been taught to do over the years, is have like all this stuff to keep yourself organized. When what we're learning is for teachers, again, not by rule, but 90% of the time, it's too much. It becomes disorganized in the organization. And what we're trying to do is get people down to one list with 5 things on it, identify one priority, have one color, maybe like one highlighter to say like, this is the thing I need to do today, not having tons of things everywhere, have some alarms, but just realistically, like when you need to do something, not 20 alarms in the day. So a lot of the websites and stuff people will go to is they really try, because they're trying to push products sometimes. They're trying to get people to do a lot of stuff when actually it's the opposite. So when I go into a room and I see 20 sticky notes and I see the person has 10 lists behind them and they have 3 calendars on their desk and they're on their phone, it's a pretty good sign that this person is doing what they can to be organized, but it's too much. And I don't know if you've had that experience or not, but we see it quite often.
Wait, several
Yes,
people in the chat are
yeah.
sort of resonating with everything you're saying in the
Mm.
slides. And someone said that, the slides look like you actually wrote them about me.
Okay, well, these are generalities, and but yes, like they're the things that we see all the time, and you know, I- they're not they're framed as deficits, but they can also be strengths. Like the thing we've noticed with teachers is teachers who are struggling with any challenge, right? They can be strengths until they're working against you. So I don't want you to sit here thinking like, oh my God, this is me. Like I I'm I have a disability. I can't do this. Why am I teaching? Like that's not the point today. The point today is like these are some of the challenges. If you see yourself, it's like, okay, is this good for me? Like, do these things help me, or do they? In which ways do they not help me? Because like we know about neurodiversity is a lot of the things that would be characterized as being like neurodiverse are really good, right? They were helpful for people. It's trying to find the things that aren't. So the disorganized part, what is that? Like you might be really curious, for instance, like um, people with ADHD are typically uh, uh, have a little bit more curiosity about things as well. So it's not just like disorganized. Like I'm kind of curious about the world, and I want to experience lots of different things. That's very positive until it's not. So just I hope you're not seeing it and thinking like, oh, I'm in big trouble. Um, and somebody just said, I'll just make sure this isn't just to me. Is this to the group? Yeah, that dropping down to 4 days. And yeah, the cost part of it is a real challenge. And we deal with that in a lot of different ways, right? Like with people who struggle with a lot of different illnesses. And it really comes down to like the lesser of two evils, I guess, at the end of the day, right? Like, and easy for me to say, uh, obviously people have to pay bills and need to be able to afford what they're doing. But at the same time, if you're really unwell, you're not functioning, also there may be a chance you end up off more, because what these challenges eventually do lead to for people, if you're burned out in September, if you're struggling all the time, if you're feeling overwhelmed, you will end up with some mental health challenges as well. So now it's not just the ADHD, it's also dealing with all the other stuff. And that can be the reason why people end up off, like period, or can't even do 4 days. So I'm not telling you what to do by any means, but what I'm saying is sometimes we do have to kind of balance out and weigh out the sort of what's the lesser of two evils there. Um, and in some jobs, depending on what you do, some people they'll even do like the work sort of equivalent of 90%. So like 1 day off every 2 weeks kind of thing. Which so again, it's always just trying to find like what's the best way to manage this within what I need overall too, because we're talking about this in a bubble, right? So all right. Now, I do need to add this though, because I think what I've noticed, there's been a shift with employers in school districts around mental health. Definitely trying to, and I think in a lot of cases have gotten their head around mental health as being, I think most people see it as being real, okay? Which I know that's ridiculous to have to say, but I do think most school districts do understand that mental health challenges are now real. Maybe not everybody. Some people do still see mental illness as mental weakness. But definitely with neurodiversity, people are seeing it as being odd or just kind of mentally weak or bad teachers. But these same employers, it's not just school districts, okay? It's employers. I'm not district bashing, but these same school districts that throw the term out diversity and neurodiversity and throwing out support for all these different kind of human rights areas, they're just words, because at the end of the day, the people who we're finding that the districts are the least willing to accommodate are people who would be categorized as being under the neurodiverse umbrella, because it, they're uncomfortable with people who are different, even when they know that this is a situation where maybe the person has autism or the person has a trauma experience. It's getting better in our experience, but still it's nowhere near where it should be. Like, it is very discriminatory still. So, we're going to talk about some ways to maybe accommodate this. It's a little scary, and I totally understand that, because most, not all, but most districts really still struggle with this. So, like, they kind of have the take, like, we embrace everybody as long as you do everything the same as everybody else in the way it's always been. This is what we struggle with all the time, because the term diversity by itself implies that not everybody's the same. But education is firmly rooted in, as a teacher, like, for students, they might get the support, but as a teacher, you have to do everything the same as it's always been and the same as everybody else. So it's a challenge when it comes, again, we have more people identifying as having autism, ADHD, trauma, and yet so that's ahead of the curve, and the school districts and employers are behind still with this, and it's a work in progress. They definitely focus more. Like, again, for students, it's totally fine. Like, they're willing to try to accommodate that. There's times actually where the student needs and the teacher needs work against each other, so that's a hard one. But it's definitely an ongoing problem. Concussion, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, because I think people know what concussion is, but it's here because it presents with a lot of the same challenges. It's really just concussion is traumatic brain injury. People get it from lots of different ways, although teachers seem to get it from mostly two ways. But again, it's a little bit more of a physical focus than in some of the other ones, more like on the headaches and the fatigue. Although people with ADHD, different sort of neurodiversity challenges, trauma can have headaches and fatigue, but a lot of brain fog and difficulty focusing. And like, this is the same, right? Like burnout and anxiety, like they're all very different in the whys, but they all present very similarly, right? I think it's important to point out the difference though between concussion and brain injury. If you're a person with a concussion, it usually is more like the short term, yesterday to a year or two. There's a time where people will say, like, you have post-concussion, but it's no longer you actually have a brain injury. And does that change anything? It does a little bit, because with concussion, the idea is that things are still going to improve, not straight line improve, plateau up and down a little bit. But with concussion, the goal is to continue moving forward, where if you're at the point where you've had a concussion for 5 years and you're kind of stuck, then changing how you think about it, that in terms of more brain injury, can also change the accommodations you're requesting, and maybe even how you see yourself functioning in the classroom. So there's a slight difference. Concussion, again, this isn't diagnostic. Concussion implies you might still be able to make some improvements. Brain injury is this might be what you have to work with. You can still improve with brain injury, but it's slower. And the two ways that teachers get concussions, balls and ice. It's almost always the same. Of course, they walk into like stuff and walls and fall and get in car accidents, but overwhelmingly, balls and ice, people getting hit in the head with soccer balls when they're not paying attention, or that comes from behind them, or they slip and fall on ice. Even in 2024, you would think ice wouldn't be an issue. Balls and ice, that's where most people get it. It affects teaching in slightly different ways from the neurodiversity, though, is that it's a sudden change. So that noise we were talking about, it's like one day I kind of had the filter and the next day I don't, and it's completely overwhelming. It completely overwhelms your brain. It completely overwhelms you emotionally as well, because everything is there. So that your inability to filter all the background stuff, it's just gone, right? So it's really overwhelming as a wave of disability, where people who have, as teachers who have ADHD and autism, they've had these challenges for a lot of their life. So they've really figured out ways to get there. Like, you don't get to be a teacher with ADHD unless you've really focused on, like, or figured out some ways to function for yourself. With concussion, it's like literally one day change. Lots of executive functioning challenges, a lot of it more with multitasking. And of course, we know like education is all just multitasking, right? So during the sort of return to work period, full-time work just usually isn't an option. Most people with concussions try to go back full-time first. If you've had this, you probably did this yourself, or somebody it is. They had their injury, they went back to work. And it was over the next couple of weeks that they realized, like, I don't think I can do this. And it's just full-time is just too much. The other thing that people will say to me that's important about concussions and teaching is it's not usually memory that's the problem. When we do neuropsych and cognitive testing for teachers who have concussion and post-concussion symptoms, their memory is usually fine. And maybe relatively decreased to where they were at one point. So from a functional perspective, it's totally functional, but relative to where they were, I used to function here and now I'm here. But from a functional perspective, their memory is usually fine. Just information's not going in the first place. It's more of a focus and attention disorder with the concussion. So memory is okay, but people will say like, I can't remember, and they try to focus on improving their memory, but memory is not really usually the issue. So we're whipping right along, and these are the trends again that we're seeing, and just sharing a little bit about that. And the last thing is trauma. Now, trauma's been around since humans were humans, and it doesn't mean like when we're talking about trauma, we're not talking about PTSD here. Okay, we're not talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma is just that sort of lasting emotional response that can just stick with people when they've had, as they perceive it, a distressing event. Okay, and it's super important to remember that there is no hierarchy of trauma. So we saw this a lot through COVID, but it happens all the time when teachers are experiencing traumatic experience in the classroom, and people start to judge them because they say that happened to me and I didn't have this response, or I was able to come back to work, or I was only off for 2 days and you've been off for 2 months. There's no hierarchy of trauma. Like there's nothing that's better or worse. Nobody's better at managing it than other people. When things happen, we all just kind of have our own responses. So a situation happens, the way that you might respond to it and the way that I might respond to it are totally different. But it doesn't mean I'm bad at it. It doesn't mean that I'm not trying. So people who have trauma, especially when it happens at school, oftentimes feel a lot of shame and helplessness and powerlessness to the point of and fear, like actual being at school with fear, but they don't feel like they can talk about it because there's a lot of judgment, especially if trauma comes at school. If you are an adult teacher and you are assaulted by a grade 1 student, there is a feeling out there that you should just be fine. And many people are not fine. Like, well, they're in grade 1. What's wrong with you? Why can't you just suck that up? You're weak. And this happens all the time. And that's people not understanding trauma. Okay, so we had a lot of people who had different triggering experiences through COVID. We had lots of people who lost family members or were just triggered by being isolated, just the fear of sort of pandemic alone. And they're still dealing with some of that trauma response even today. I'm not going to get too much into this, but I do want to point out that, even just like violence in schools and trauma, they're linked, but it's not the only way that people experience trauma. But I will point out that the EFTO just last year put out in the member violence survey, like the numbers of teachers, just from elementary teachers who are experiencing violence in and of itself, the numbers are, they're shockingly high, right? They're shockingly high. Saying that, the people who actually experience violence at school that could ask for help, only about half of people do. So that's really the main reason I have that here, is really to point out that there's still so much shame about this and the idea that I should be okay. So people don't ask for support when it comes to trauma. I'm going to skip this one. So we see the response in people with fight or flight, right? And there's also freeze and fawn. But a lot of people notice fight or flight. So we see these responses the same as everybody. People who seem anxious or withdrawn in times of stress. So you might see there might be some stress in the school environment. The person kind of just like ducks away. Because if you think if I've had experiences related to trauma and conflict, I can't be around that, right? You may see people who are over responding or over emoting. So we think a lot of people as being like dramatic, needy. They're sort of like always over responding to things without maybe thinking, where does that come from? Maybe it's not just them trying to be difficult. Maybe this is coming from a place of their past, or this situation is very triggering, right? And we see that people with trauma oftentimes struggle with sort of seeing gray in problem solving. If you're getting chased by a lion, you are not supposed to be ticking through a bunch of boxes like, what should I do now? Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I do this? Should I do that? No, you're supposed to think, I have option A or option B. Okay, so I can do this or this. When I have trauma, my ability to go through option A, B, C, D, E is even more diminished. So if I'm in a triggering situation, I might just see there's one way out of this. This is how I need to deal with this. And we think like, well, why are you doing that? It's kind of weird. But that's maybe for me the only solution I can see because I've had this trauma response and it's stressful, right? So you see that a lot. Just kind of the same things we've talked about with the other stuff, where we see people who, just easily overwhelmed and disorganized, and to the point where like some teachers actually do, like they need to leave the school, like whatever's happening in that school, um, uh, at that time, they either need to leave in that moment or even just leave the school in general. How are we doing for time here? Oh, we have a little bit. So I'm not going to get too much into sort of the trauma and how from a systemic base, but we do know that the way to help people manage trauma and to prevent trauma in the workplace is with what being trauma aware. So we hear about like trauma safe and trauma aware workplaces, and it means a lot. Again, a lot of it is just words from a district perspective and from an employer perspective. And again, this isn't a COVID talk, but we saw this a lot with COVID, right? Where many decisions were being made about sort of education and about teachers and about how teachers manage day to day. But nobody ever asked teachers what they thought about it. In some cases, they didn't even ask the unions. Like now, I will give everybody cut a little bit of slack because a lot of people are just kind of like, even at the employer and district level, just trying their best to get through day to day and didn't know how to do it either. But when we think about what it means to be trauma aware, it means like including people in decision making and building environments of safety and trust and focusing on strengths. And it was the complete opposite during COVID. And so there was no mind paid to how teachers felt, and not just the trauma of the situation, which was there, but also the trauma that could be created by the situation. So when we think about how do we create trauma aware spaces, it's with these points in mind, right? So trying to be involving people in choice and collaboration. So even if it's your colleagues, or even thinking about what you need yourself, like thinking about what's wrong with my space, what do I need, and figure out maybe I need to build more of an environment around me that has more trust or more safety, instead of just I don't like it here. Like being a little bit more specific on what is it about here that's not working for you if you have an experience of trauma, right? And I think it starts with kind of having a slightly different approach from ourselves as well, but also like when we think about how like teachers for teachers and admin for teachers and district for teachers, is the starting point is, as somebody pointed out, is just like being kind, like being trauma informed and trauma aware. The starting point is just kind of being kind. And instead of thinking if somebody is a problem or something somebody's doing is weird or they're sort of over responding to things, it's more thinking about why could this be happening for this person? Are they maybe coming from a place of trauma? Is this something that's triggering for them? Is there something I can do to help moderate this? Can I help them? Is there something I can help them with, like in terms of what do they need? So we tend to, because we live our own lives, we tend to think about like, what do I need, which is great. But if we were truly trauma informed and the system was truly trauma informed, we'd just be a little bit more mindful that, some people might be struggling in this situation because they're struggling in this situation. They're not actually trying to be a problem. Make sense? And the same could be said with autism. The same could be said with ADHD. The same could be said with essentially any challenge, right? But with trauma, it's really being trauma informed really does mean starting point is if we just think of everybody having trauma, like if you thought, and again, it's not about you, you're not doing anything wrong, but if we all just thought about everybody has trauma, the starting point would always be not like, how is this affecting me and why is this person being such a jerk? It's what can I maybe do to support this person and make this a better outcome for both of us, right? That's what trauma informed really means. I'm just going to point this one thing out though, as in terms of emerging, a lot of this stuff looks like long COVID as well. So, long COVID presents very similar to concussion, very similar to ADHD, and in some cases even very similar to autism. So there's been some people who've come to us that I think I might have autism. When we look back through their history, the symptoms are relatively new, and it's actually looking more like long COVID than some of these other things. But I will point out that long COVID looks very similar from a cognitive perspective to some of these other things. Okay, so and if anybody has any thoughts here, I'd like to hear them. But again, I know how this goes here. So if nobody says anything, don't worry. It's not awkward. But these are the trends we've seen. Like since COVID, we're seeing more and more teachers reach out for support with these things specifically: concussion, ADHD, neurodiversity, autism, and trauma. ADHD is by far the biggest. Does anybody have any idea of like why that might be? Why in the last 5 years have we seen more under these umbrellas? I'll just, if nobody responds in a second, I'll just move on. I'll tell you what I think. I think what happened during COVID is it really pointed out people who had difficulty with change. So some people kind of went with the flow. Some of that's just their personalities and their backgrounds and how they were raised and their genetics and all these things. But a lot of people looked around and realized that they really were challenged by change and the idea that I was doing okay until they started throwing all these changes at me. So for some people, they realized it was anxiety. But for a lot of people, they started exploring and thinking to their backgrounds around, like, I've kind of always struggled with these things that are changing. Like once I get into my own routines and an environment where I feel safe, I'm good. But with change, I'm not able to do that. So I think that's why we're seeing is, and also since COVID, there's been more openness for people to identify both online and in person that they are struggling with neurodiversity, because neurodiversity from COVID has become more of a thing. So as it's become, just like, mental health did 15 years ago, it started being more on people's radar. Neurodiversity is actually more being on people's radar. So people are more likely to ask for help. And similar with concussion, it's not the same as neurodiversity, but those challenges, people would bang their head and they would just think like, oh, I need to work harder. And they're realizing now since COVID that I can't do that. Like that's not going to work for me. So I think that's what we're seeing in terms of why. There is not a hard and fast reason, but I do think that a lot of it has to do with directly people struggling with change and then being asking for help.
Perfect. We've got a couple of comments in the
Mm,
chat. We have someone who says, fantastic,
mm.
fascinating. Thank you so much for putting those pieces together. I also wonder if more screen time exacerbates ADHD.
100% it does. Yeah. And again, not, we'll say for every single person, but it's light noise and it's just sort of time drilling into your brain, right? So a screen time does for sure. I do think that social media in this case was actually a positive. I agree. Like the term neurodiversity is so much more known now and it's becoming more accepted that I do think that I think in this, maybe in this one weird instance, in some cases, social media has been really helpful in even people knowing knowing what adult ADHD even is. I think a lot of even teachers just thought it was just for kids, right? So the openness of that. Um,
And
so
then,
Peter's asking about like, is it change or the increased demands? Well, it's both. But and again, it's not really even a judgment, but I think what happened is people saw that some people were coping with the change and were started asking themselves, why aren't I? And there might not have been an answer being ADHD, but it did get people starting to think a little bit about what maybe this isn't just me. Like maybe there's something happening with me that makes it so I'm not dealing with this as well. And again, with the openness then of more and more people talking about it, we've seen it come up a lot more, right? Yeah. Uh, so Leanne has written that the pressures of teaching have been compounded since COVID. I absolutely agree. And we're still like COVID's kind of off the radar a little bit, right? Like it's off the radar, but we're still seeing the effects of COVID. Again, I think some of it is positive, but we're definitely still seeing the negative effects of COVID. And one of the things, and this came up in our last talk, but it's come up in all my talks, is teachers who started isolating during COVID, a lot of them are still isolating. And it's because they're still trying to catch up and get in front of all the things that have changed, and also being a little bit fearful of being exposed, which I don't agree. They need to do that, but I've had teachers say like, I don't want to interact with other people because I'm barely holding on. I don't want them to know that. So there's a little fear of like kind of being exposed there. That goes along with teaching in general. Yeah, COVID is absolutely still here. Absolutely. Teachers in general are afraid of being exposed with anything. Like I work with teachers who will go grocery shopping 100 kilometers away so they don't run into parents if they're off on medical leave, which is ridiculous on so on the surface, but when you look at why people are doing that, it makes sense they're doing that, but we really don't want people doing. But it's a real fear of teachers being seen as being incompetent, right? Regardless of what that is. So I'll just whip through a couple things here before we finish. There's lots of different accommodations. So if we're not going to get to them all. If you have any specific questions, we do have time after for questions, and that's kind of what I put these slides together. Is if anybody has any specific questions about accommodation. At the end of the day, there's the accommodations can be about sort of the specific, like matching people to specific roles, matching to even specific schools, which is a little bit harder, and also specific schedules around part-time or gradual returns to work, or just like people, having return to work planning with some modifications with how they do things. As much as the school districts are not super open to the idea of neurodiversity yet, if it's medicalized and if there's involvement of doctors, it's hard to ignore. Now, it is a misconception that if a doctor says something, the district has to do it. They don't. But if something is medicalized, the districts have more obligation to try to accommodate things. So when it comes to a lot of this, the way that we can sort of help people with accommodation options is just kind of really straightforward. Like it's not, there are some specific things we do for people that are specific to that person, but from an actual like accommodation standpoint, they're not that out there. It's just providing clear instructions and sort of as it works for that person, right? As it works for that person. Streamlining communication. So maybe communication comes just from like one avenue or one person instead of coming from multiple places. Informing people of changes and not just dropping it on them. Providing support through transition periods. Like these are all things that are pretty straightforward, right? Like having some say in terms of where people do get critical feedback. Like this is all pretty, like it's kind of like just being kind at the end of the day. So these are things that people can look for, and the idea of sensory friendly classrooms. Now, on the slides that follow, I've included, like, I purposely put in the slides some stuff that I know will just be on for you for your handouts. But if you're thinking about like what are some structural and sensory ways to be accommodated, there's a lot. There's a lot of things that you can look at, right? There's lighting and noise and stimulation, and there's like noise reducing earplugs and light covers and voice amplification, which some people works and some people doesn't, but works. And the idea of like having a safety plan for trauma, which is something that we're seeing more and more of, where there's a plan that actually says if somebody is triggered, what does that look like? What do they need? Who's going to do what? So we're not going to go through all this, but I have this included on you for your handout, where is if you want some specific information about these things, it's here. To take away from today, and I'm going to wrap up in 2 seconds, is if you want to think about like some things to think about, I have a couple of examples on the handouts as well around like, how do you accommodate these things? So a teacher in a community who was, assaulted by somebody, never went to a legal proceeding, and now they see that person in their school. Like that's a trauma situation. How can that person be accommodated, right? And they can, and it just might take some problem solving and some support, okay? Or a kindergarten teacher who has ADHD. How can that person possibly be accommodated when a kindergarten class is like the noisiest place in the world, right? So these are some things to think about. And if you have any specific questions, by all means, let's do that for the next little while. I'm not going anywhere. But that's just the generalities of the trends we're seeing. And hopefully this has been a little helpful for you. And again, if you have any specific questions, you can always come right to me.
So in the coming days, you'll receive a follow-up workshop, a follow-up email with a link to our evaluation forms for this webinar, other OTF resources, and a link to the archive session. And before I let you go, Wade, I do want to thank you for your second session. It was really, really informative, and everyone in the chat seems to have walked away with information that a lot of us didn't have. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
No,
And if
thanks
you
for having
want
me.
to,
Appreciate it.
you're welcome. And
Yeah.
if you want to hear Wade again, he's back on March the 5th at 4:30 for his third and final installment for his wellness workshops on beyond resilience and burnout, mental health challenges, and education.